today's breakfast, and good morning to you to our guest speaker, Mr. Mark Haywood, who is here in his capacity as the Executive Director of Section 27, which is a public interest non-governmental organization whose core mandate is to ensure that the state lives up to its human rights obligations. I think Mr. Haywood really needs no introduction, but nonetheless, Mark has enjoyed a long career as an activist, and he's perhaps more well known for his fundamental role that he played in the setting up of the Treatment Action Campaign, which, as we know, led to the states, which as we know, led to the forcing of the state's hand in the provision of ARVs and Nevirapine for deserving South Africans. But nonetheless, today he's here to talk about corruption. And this week, the big talk around corruption, besides its rather pervasive nature in the South African context, has been the release of the Corruption Index by Corruption Watch together with Transparency International. And South Africa has stagnated, and South Africa has been in pretty much the same position for the past 5 years. And even though that position is more or less better than a lot of other African nations, nonetheless, Transparency International ranks South Africa with other countries where there is a serious corruption problem. And of course, there are individuals who say that corruption is a victimless crime. But I think today, Mr. Haywood's talk is going to show that that is simply not true, that corruption really hurts the most vulnerable people in society. So, Mr. Mark Haywood is going to speak for 20 minutes, and thereafter we're going to open the floor for a question and answer session for about 30 minutes or so. And that question and answer session is going to be moderated by Dr. Dirk Brandt from the School for Public Leadership. But before I hand the floor over to Mr. Mark, I'm going to call upon Ms. Christina Teichmann, who is the resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And for some of you that might not be familiar with our foundation, I would like to say a few words about the history of the Konrad Adenauer Foundations, our aims and objectives. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation. We are affiliated to the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's party in Germany. And our main objectives are to promote democracy, good governance, and the rule of law. The system of political foundation in Germany is quite unique. You don't get it anywhere else in the world, and it goes back to the time after the World War II, where it was felt that the German population needed civic education, and it would best be done by political foundations that provide, that are affiliated to political parties and that provide quite a broad spectrum of political beliefs and convictions. So, Konrad Adenauer Foundation has been for many years in South Africa since the early 80s, and we have witnessed the democratic transition process in South Africa firsthand. And what we learned from South Africa, but also from other countries, is that democracy is not a given. A constitution, to have a good constitution, and often South Africa's constitution is hailed as one of the most modern constitutions in the world, does not mean that the rights enshrined in the constitution are implemented and adhered to. So I think what we learned is that people, civil society, politicians, we all need to protect and nurture democracy, and I think civil society has been very active in the last couple of years, and that might be a good thing, you know, in times of crisis, that civil society gets active. And I think we have seen in South Africa after '94 that civil society became a little bit complacent, that people thought, you know, everything is sorted, we have democracy now. But then very soon one realized, you know, we have crises such as HIV/AIDS, and civil society woke up again and became active again. And I think we can be very glad to have NGOs and civil society organizations like Section 27 that ensure that topics such as corruption are highlighted, that you know, we read about corruption in the newspaper. Sometimes it gets too much. Every day you read about corruption in the newspaper. You have all these headlines about the textbook scandal in Kandla and all the other things, but to read it in the newspaper also means that there are people, there are civil society organizations that make sure you read it in the newspaper and that it gets brought to the public attention and that people do something about it. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our guest speaker, Mark Haywood today. I'm very happy that he came all the way to Cape Town and brought us some rain. And thank you very much all for coming. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. And I'm glad I brought some rain. There is indeed rain in Gauteng. What was last year a very, very brown, dry part of the country is beginning to look green and fresh again. And long may it last. Thank you also for the invitation to speak to this breakfast. I really appreciate it. Not least because these days to be an activist feels like you're going at 180 kilometers an hour through every day. It doesn't leave enough time to reflect and think about what you're experiencing and what you are seeing. So when you get an invitation like this, it at least forces you to sit down for 3 or 4 hours and consider and join certain dots together. And I found it very helpful to take the 3 hours preparing for this to join dots, and I hope that you find that what I have to say makes sense and offers some, hopefully some new insights and ideas on this issue of the linkages between corruption and governance and the Constitution. So I want to start just by 2 stories, which in a sense go straight into this question as to whether corruption is a victimless crime. 3 years ago, almost to the day, the 24th of January, 2014, a little boy, grade R, made his way in Chibeng village in Limpopo to his 2nd or 3rd day at school in grade R. At break time, that little boy went out to the toilets at the back of the school and clambered on top of a corrugated iron, cardboard, boxy type of thing, and tried to go to the toilet and fell through into the pit below. He tried, and the story is that a couple of his friends tried to alert the teacher to the fact that he dropped into this pit. But the teacher had 45 children in the class and probably couldn't be bothered. And so when it came to lunchtime, Michael was missing. And the school started to try to find this little 5.5-year-old. And they alerted his father, and his father came running from 10 kilometers away. And his father was the person who first looked in the toilet and could only see a hand sticking out above, I don't like to use bad language in polite company, but above the ship, just a hand. That was the end of Michael Komapi, age 5.5. In the same year, I think, a little girl by the name of Angel Sibanda, who lived in Diepsloot, which is very close to where I live, went to school one morning, and in Diepsloot, part of Diepsloot is built on a kind of wetland. So when it rains, the rain channels through the middle of the township. It's been there forever. any sensible town planner could plan for that. She tried to cross this swollen wetland on her way to school and failed. That was the end of Angel Savannah. Her body was found a few kilometers further away a few days later, somewhere down the Juxgay River. And I'm mentioning these two stories because both of them are about rights violations. These are not accidental deaths. They are about rights violations. Both of them occurred in the school setting. Both of those children were rights bearers in terms of our Constitution because they both had a right to a basic education. And as you should all know, the right to a basic education in South Africa is not a progressively realizable right. It's an immediately realizable right. Children have a right to the highest quality education available resources within the swiftest period that it is possible to provide that education. And what we also know is that education is more than just a teacher, although a teacher is very important. Education is also dependent on a textbook and a toilet and on the ability to get safely to and from school. All of those are parts of the right to basic education. It's not something I understood for a long time because I went to a nice school. Now, the overall theme of these breakfasts, as I understand it, is fighting corruption and promoting good governance. But I was specifically asked to talk to the issue of how corruption affects the delivery and realization of socio-economic rights, which I think is a very important question, precisely because these are not victimless crimes. And what I'm going to try to do is to put corruption into a constitutional context and persuade you how it is that corruption undermines the whole schema of our Constitution. And to do that, I have to start just by saying a little bit about this issue of socio-economic rights and the place that socio-economic rights occupy within our Constitution. You know, our Constitution is very novel in certain respects. It is one of the most ambitious, far-sighted, forward-looking constitutions in the world. And the novelty of the Constitution starts right at the beginning, in the preamble, where it says that the aim of the Constitution is to establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Where it also says that the aim of the Constitution is to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. Those are quotations. But what is important about this issue of democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights is that we didn't settle for a constitution that just says democracy and rights. The inclusion of this two words, social justice, must have meaning. And the inclusion of the words social justice, thank you, is something, the notion of social justice should be something that infuses the whole Constitution and the whole approach to government. Social justice is what makes our Constitution a radical Constitution. It is what makes tips our Constitution away from so-called neutrality to being a Constitution that is avowedly pro-poor. But the question is, how do you get from social injustice to social justice? And that's where you get to this question, well, what is the role of rights? And you go a little bit further into the Constitution, not very far, chapter 2, and you get to the Bill of Rights. And you get to these socio-economic rights. Rights which are premised on, in my belief, on the recognition that if you're to get to social justice, you are going to have to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill these rights. The rights to housing, the rights to access to healthcare services, the rights to sufficient food and water, the rights to basic education. And so, those rights are not just there hanging loosely from the tree. They're part of the scheme, they're part of the equation. And achieving these rights is fundamental to achieving equality. Section 9 of our Constitution, the right to equality. Not just the right to legal equality. The language is different. The right to the full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. Full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. You can't free the potential of all people if you die when you're 5.5. You're a dead person. If you die when you're 5.5. Can't free the potential of the poor child when that child doesn't get enough nutrition from before she's even born. Gets born, gets starved intellectually, gets starved physically, handicapped at every turn of the way. Inequality, inequality, inequality from cradle or from before cradle through to grave. The Constitution rejects that. And that's the schema, and I think it's a schema that those of us who think about it and those of us who really want justice feel proud about. And that's how we have to look at this question of corruption. Now, on the surface, our government is trying, certainly says it's trying, I'm not sure if you believe that, but on the surface it is trying to meet these obligations. If you take, for example, spending on health. We spend on health about, the last time I looked, about 8.5% of GDP on health. That's equivalent, if not better than other middle-income countries. Okay, forget for a minute the fact that half of that is made up by private spending on health, and the public part is probably insufficient, not probably, is insufficient, but nonetheless, 8.5% on health. Education, the biggest part of our budget is spent on basic education. But we have the worst outcomes on health of any equivalent country. We have the worst outcomes on basic education, despite what we spend on trying to realize these two rights. And I think the question we have to ask is why? Why is that the case? Now, I'm not a PowerPoint person, which is why you don't see any PowerPoint up there. I'm not very clever at drawing PowerPoint, but if I was clever at drawing PowerPoints, what you see now is you see a vicious, I try and draw a vicious circle. Because what I want to try and show to you in that vicious circle is the connection between corruption and socio-economic rights, and further corruption, and further denial of socio-economic rights, and further corruption, and round we go. And the connection is this. I would argue, and it's not just that there's objective, there's empirical evidence to support this, that corruption has become a major factor that prevents the realization of socio-economic rights, thereby perpetuating inequality and the legacy of apartheid. That's the first part of the argument. Corruption prevents realization of socio-economic rights. By doing so, it maintains inequalities, in particular racial inequalities. The second part is that enduring inequality in turn feeds corruption, because it means that we do not have enough skilled people coming out of our education system in particular for our economy and government, meaning that a culture of corruption, a culture of lawlessness, a culture where why should I respect the law if the law doesn't respect me, is continued. And I think this is quite an important point. I was chatting to a very good person I respect a lot called Ralph Matech, he's just written a very good book called When Zuma Goes. It's thinking forward, not fast enough. But it's a very, very well written, very well balanced, thought out book. But Ralph said to me when we were chatting the other day, you know, the problem is that nobody's actually looking at the culture of corruption, the way our culture accepts corruption, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But you don't just, culture just doesn't fall from the sky. Culture emerges out of material conditions in which people live. But the point is, inequality feeds corruption. The next part of that circle is that this continued inequality creates social instability. Social instability leads to a rejection of the Constitution by poor people. And that is what we are beginning to see. Social instability creates fertile ground for populism anywhere in the world. That's what we're seeing in our country. And populism, in turn, connects us back not to socio-economic rights now, but to civil and political rights. Because what we're seeing in South Africa now is renewed threats to civil and political rights. And quite often it is linked to the failure to realize social and economic rights. So I know, and this is not an exaggeration, that for my humble work on trying to realize the right to health, that I'm under surveillance at times. My house was broken into in very strange circumstances at the end of last year. All sorts of funny things are happening. But we also know that this government of ours is contemplating new restrictive forms of legislation, that the security apparatus is being given carte blanche to do its thing, etc., etc. So, in that circle that you can't see up there, you have to see that all of these things are connected. And that really this issue of corruption, far from being a victimless crime, is actually a very, very dangerous thing for the schema of the Constitution as a whole and for our social stability in our future. And therefore, the converse of that is that breaking corruption and restoring good governance is fundamental to the constitutional project. That's why 5 years ago we set up Corruption Watch. We saw it coming and we decided to set up Corruption Watch. Today, Corruption Watch is completely independent of Section 27. It works very well. It could be better, it could be bigger, it could be more effective, but at least there's a voice that's starting to tackle corruption. But what I want to talk about now in the last 5-7 minutes of my presentation is, I've given you, if you like, the theory of what I think is happening, but I want to now persuade you, although I don't think you particularly need persuading, about the direct impact of corruption on socio-economic rights and what it is doing to people. A private law firm quotes of the Limpopo government, a part of a judgment from the Constitutional Court 2 years ago, which I loved, which says, there's a higher duty on the state to respect the law, fulfill procedural requirements, and to tread respectfully when dealing with rights. It is the Constitution's primary agent, the government. It must do right, and it must do it properly. And that's why the focus on government. You know, quite a few of my lefty friends say, why don't you leave the private sector off? Let them off scot-free. Private sector have got things to answer. But government is our sword. That the Constitution creates government as our sword, including to properly regulate the private sector to comply with the spirit and the letter of the law of the Constitution. If the sword's broken, then you can't deal with the private sector properly. Or if the sword is bent in half, the private sector laughs at you and says, what a load of hypocrisy. Here's you people thieving right, left and centre, you're complaining about us thieving right, left and centre, really, you know? And that's part of the mindset. But in our work at Section 27, you know, we witness the corrosive effect of corruption on rights on an almost daily basis. And I'll just give you some examples to try to prove the theory that I've presented to you. We work in two areas, fundamentally. The right to basic education, which, as I said, is a right that is immediately realizable. It's not qualified in any way. There's no progressive realization, no available resources. You have a right to a basic education. That's not understood well enough in civil society. It's not understood well enough in government. And yet, the right to basic education is impeded by corruption. For me, the reason why we have such poor outcomes can't just be put at the door of corruption, but the door of corruption is a major factor in that. Let me give you just two examples. You know, when we started our work on basic education in 2012, looking into it, trying to see how we could invoke the Constitution, etc., the first thing that hit us was the Limpopo textbooks crisis, which I think you probably all are well, familiar with. I'm not going to go into the facts, except to say that in 2012, grades R, 2, 3, 4, and 10 didn't have textbooks because it was a new curriculum. They just didn't. There were no textbooks for anybody in those grades. By the way, it's now 5 years since then. All those textbooks are meant to be replaced every 5 years. That's been conveniently forgotten. There's no new textbooks for grades R, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10, or whatever it is. There should be, but there's not even a suggestion that they're going to be put available. But when we went into and started looking into what was happening in Limpopo, and it was basically that the whole responsibility for the provision of textbooks had been given to a private company called EduSolutions, who we all looked very closely at in 2012 and 13 and then let off the hook after that. And so EduSolutions remains a major player. Lots of prima facie evidence of corruption, corrupt practices, but they're still doing business, big time. But the government sent in a chap called Karodia to look, and one of the things Karodia said is, I can't find 2 billion rand in the Limpopo budget. Just can't find 2 billion rand. 2 billion rand has been stolen. And you can imagine that. The Limpopo education budget is about 24 billion rand a year. 2 or 3 billion rand just stolen. And that impacts on education. Really don't need to show you how. And it hasn't changed. This year, the latest crisis, which you're probably seeing, is to do with stationery. And this is what I was looking at the legal correspondence last night. Again, all the signs seem to say corruption, because there used to be 4 companies that supplied stationery to the schools in Limpopo. Suddenly there's only 1 company now providing stationery to the schools in Limpopo. The tender was awarded secretly in November of last year. The other tenderers weren't told that the tender had been provided, and now the 1 company can't supply the stationery. So now it's the end of January and the kids don't have stationery. And it doesn't feel painful to us, but we're parents, and you know what it's like if your little boy or little girl comes home and says, I don't have paper to write on, or I don't have pens. You know the anxiety that creates. And that's going on throughout the system in 100 different ways, and that is linked to corruption. When it comes to health, the situation is very little better. In 2011, as we were thinking about Corruption Watch, we commissioned some research into corruption in the health sector, both public and private. And in 2011-12, the people who did the research, who were people who know the health system very, very well, estimated that the total cost of corruption in the public and private healthcare sectors at that point was about 20 billion rand a year. roughly divided between public and private, so they were both equally involved in it. And they found, this is just a quote, the research concludes that the risk of corruption in the South African public health sector is currently high, if not rampant, when considering all the potential areas of threat. And we hit it every day. I'll give you one example, because it hasn't had enough publicity, and I was told there's some journalists in here. Last year I got a phone call from a chap in a hospital in Pelanomi Hospital in Bloemfontein. And I'm going to finish in a few minutes. A doctor, and he says, you know what's just happened? We manage the geriatric ward. And the MEC has come in and has ordered that we provide stem cell treatment, unproven stem cell treatment to geriatric patients requiring knee operations. And they've taken the list and they've set it up and so on. And it's going to cost us 3 million rand a month, and the contract is for 3 years. That was going to be 100 million rand for an unproven treatment. Thank you, Dr. Benny Malekwani, who used to be the MEC for Health. Then he got demoted to become MEC for something else. He's still MEC. So luckily this doctor phoned, and we could phone the Director General and the Minister of Health, and they moved fast. And there was an investigation. By the way, people died, again, for journalists. At least 2 people died as a result of this unproven treatment. It was stopped, and there's a criminal investigation, but then it goes underground again. But that was 100 million rand. Now, whilst we can steal 100 million rand for unproven stem cell treatment, we have a cadre of community healthcare workers across the country who we say we can't afford to employ, and so we pay them like 1,500 rand a month, if they're lucky, for 9 months of the year, and then the provincial departments run out of money, and then they don't get any money for 3 months. So, this money that is being stolen, not only does it hurt the people that it's being stolen from, it's money that, if properly allocated, could be switched and put into something like community healthcare workers. Our HIV program and our TB program is failing. We have 2,800 new HIV infections of young girls a week in this country, most of them in school. But we don't have community healthcare workers who can go and work in the schools, talk to people, play a role in prevention. So if you can't see the connections, I think looking at you can all see the connections. There was another research report which I'd advise you to look at, but produced by Letitia Rispel and people, that also looks very, very scary. Better than our report, in the sense that they go through the AG reports over the last 5 or 6 years and quantify the amount of money from each provincial department in irregular or wasteful or whatever expenditure. And they say poor governance and corruption share a reciprocal relationship and negatively impact on the morale of healthcare providers. Well, I think that's a bit of an understatement, because it does a lot more than negatively impact on the morale of healthcare workers, although it does. Time is almost up. The last thing I want to just say, to give you evidence, in a few days' time, this report into the Life Esidimeni, this mental health facility in Gauteng, will be released by Professor Makgoba. And it's going to show you a lot more deaths than the figures have been put out up to now. It's horrid. But you have to ask the question, why was the Gauteng Health Department in such a rush to move people out of a facility where they had good quality care into 20 or 30 little facilities where there was no care at all? What was the deal with those little NGOs that were suddenly set up to care for people with serious mental illnesses? Again, if you're a journalist and you're interested in investigation, I promise you, if you ask that question and start looking, what you're going to find is that the deal was probably that somebody was going to benefit from getting those patients out. The patients didn't benefit because a large number of them died. So it's a crisis. It's a crisis in the private sector. I don't have time because I've talked for too long, but it is equally rampant in the private sector, and the corruption in the private healthcare sector is not irrelevant to the public healthcare sector, because
We can't afford to put 56 million people on public health care, so we need a private healthcare sector that can hold as many people, that's as affordable to as many people as possible. But collusion and price fixing in the private healthcare sector is rampant. They can't be let off the hook. The quality of care in much of the private healthcare sector, I'm making this as a generalization, but it's not always good quality of care. In particular, the private healthcare sector has a huge problem with nosocomial infections of various types due to very, very poor infection control. So the notion that private is good and public is bad, I'm afraid, is not true. In private, you get good 5-star hotel care. In public, you find some of the best doctors that you will find not only in South Africa but in the world, but it's in 1-star facilities and conditions. And we've got to look at the two together. So just to conclude, the question is who's responsible for combating this corruption and protecting these rights? As you all know, we have the institutions, we have the policies. We have a problem that some of the institutions get captured, recaptured, uncaptured, recaptured, etc. But we don't have enough institutions at a high level, the public protectors, etc., to manage this problem. Actually, where we really need to be tackling corruption is where it occurs. And that's where we should be looking at strengthening institutions. Now, if you take the two issues of health and basic education that I've talked to, at the level of the community, the places that do identify these problems, by the way, everybody knows what's going on, are in clinic committees, hospital boards, school governing bodies, etc. But they are neglected in the thinking about who can stop this. And they're also underinvested in. So luckily, there's a legal framework for SGBs, for how the SGBs are elected. It doesn't prevent SGBs from being captured, and they frequently are. Corruption Watch has documented that. But there's no legal framework around clinic committees and hospital boards, which are crucial to this issue of good governance, the theme of your breakfast discussions. Good governance should start at the level of the community. But you can't have good governance if you think that these bodies are just going to miraculously come into existence and support themselves. There's no legal framework for clinic committees or hospital boards. There's no clear guidelines at the national level as to how they should exist. So that, I think, is where we have to concentrate. And as I said, the biggest problem, where I agree with Ralph, is partly changing the culture. So just to finish, what do we do about this? You know, I read, as I'm sure many of you have, Justice Moseneke's book, My Own Liberator. And Moseneke in that book, right towards the end, makes some quite interesting points about socio-economic rights. One of the points that Moseneke makes is a quote. He says, "There was no pact on how to achieve the equality and social justice the Constitution promised." No pact on how to achieve the equality and social justice. I think that's right. And he calls this one of the, quote, wrinkles of our democratic transition. And he says that it was partly because of this that the Constitution, quote, imposed qualified duties on the state to facilitate access to social goods. But these socio-economic entitlements were premised on and limited to state transfers as and when the funds were available. That's Moseneke. I think he's right, and I think it's worth interrogating that. But what we didn't anticipate was the way in which these so-called socio-economic entitlements would become a source for plunder by thieves. And what we didn't anticipate was the way in which very often the thieves would be within the state apparatus itself, because they don't buy in to the constitutional schema. We didn't anticipate a situation where Dick Turpin, if you remember Dick Turpin, might be the president himself, which is the situation, frankly, that we face. We didn't anticipate a situation where there'd be a sense of impunity by those involved in corruption. Dr. Benny Malekwane is a man who has mastered impunity. MEC, former MEC for Health in the Free State, as have others. And the law seems insufficient to get these people. That's a problem. One of the things we're looking at in Section 27, and I'll finish on this point, is how we can make the law start to now hold some of these people personally liable. So when they go to court, when they get taken to court, they don't just dip into the massive reserve of taxpayers' money, but actually they are made to pay for themselves. And there's some interesting litigation that's going on which is giving us hope, which isn't in the realm of socio-economic rights, it's in relation to Sibanye gold mine and so on at the moment, but where personal liability is being sought against Zwane, MEC Zwane, who's also one of the crooks, in relation to some problems of that gold mine. You know, people, I saw Sheila raise her eyebrows. Zwane is a crook. Zwane is the man who forced his relative to be admitted to Bethlehem Hospital, who got Malakwane to kick somebody out of the ICU unit at Bethlehem Hospital in the Free State so that Zwane's relative could get in and occupy that bed, MEC Zwane, the friend. We made a complaint regarding corruption about 2.5 years ago, but they haven't even been able to interview MEC Zwane. We know that Zwane is relative. And I think we have to, I'm doing this deliberately, we have to start calling these people out by their names. So, my concluding argument is that this is a very serious problem. I hope I haven't depressed you by painting such a horrible picture, because you shouldn't be depressed, because at community levels people are beginning to push back against this and they see the problems. And it is depressing, particularly if you live in this situation, it's depressing. But I think what's happened in the last 1.5 years is that as a country, we've started to wake up to the realities. And I see an incredible vibrancy at community level and within civil society. And I guess my appeal to you is where you have connections, do everything that you can to support civil society, to mobilize around these issues, to research them, to act against them, and to put the country back on course. We're not a failed state, it's not too late. We know what the problem is, and I think that we can actually address it. Thank you, I spoke a bit too much.